Perhaps the most formative insight of recent decades is the call for the integration of mission and theological education. This comes from the ICETE Manifesto II document declaration published in 2022. If we are going to rise and really meet the global demand for church leaders around the world, theological education must be recentered on its true course, on its true purpose. And that's what we are going to be examining today. This declaration, this document that I mentioned, this manifesto, this was a document prepared over the course of 2.5 years by people from all over the world as part of ICETE's new initiatives. ICETE's been around for 40 plus years, and I'll talk more about that in other videos. But for now, what I want you to realize that this is no simple little document. This is something that was produced by leaders from every part of the world coming together to examine, to pray about, to think about what should we say today in 2022 into this era that we have about theological education. The full quote of this statement reads as follows: "Perhaps the most formative insight of recent decades is the call for the integration of mission and theological education. The purpose of theological education," it goes on to say, "the purpose of theological education must be defined within the framework of the Missio Dei and a missional self-understanding of the church." Notice what this global declaration about theological education is focusing on. It is in essence saying that we must be thinking about theological education as part of God's greater missional redemptive plan that he has set out from the very beginning of time. The whole of the scriptures talk about the whole of redemptive plan of God from Genesis through and to Revelation. And what we're saying here, what ICETE is saying through this manifesto is, it is the same for theological education. Theological education exists so that it can advance and strengthen the church in its mission be carried out that God has given to the church. And having this missional self-understanding of theological education. The reason I highlight this is as I travel and as I interact with leaders from all parts of the world about theological education, sometimes I find that as the leaders and even professors and those that are involved in their programs, and even some of the on the non-formal side, I'm not just talking about the formal, I'm talking about non-formal as well. Sometimes I find that as they think about and develop their programs, their curricula, and their courses and so on and so forth, there might be some, but there is rarely enough focus on how is it that we are strengthening the church for its mission. Going back to that ICETE declaration that we cited a few moments ago. I also find that over time, theological education is becoming more and more strained, more difficult to manage. This is especially so after COVID, isn't it? Since COVID, we find a lot of things globally, a lot of areas in culture and society, in the church and in theological education, a lot of things are not the same. And we need to really acknowledge that. But one of the things that is certainly not the same is theological education and its strength sometimes in certain parts of the world. Some have done better than others, there's no question about that, but some are being challenged. And so here's what I say sometimes about theological education and the church. The church is decreasingly the aim of theological education as theological education turns more inward to preserve and survive rather than turning outward, extending outward to prepare and serve. And sometimes it is not necessarily intentional. The leaders of schools and programs all over the world are being challenged on a number of different fronts. Let's acknowledge that too, and especially, as I said a moment ago, after COVID. But still, the practical outcome of that is that many are turning more inward simply to preserve what they have and survive as programs rather than being able to turn outward to prepare and serve the next generation of leaders around the world. On this topic, there's much that has been written, but recently, over the last few years, Dr. Mark Young, former president of Denver Seminary, wrote a book the book, The Hope of the Gospel, and there will be more information about that book in this video. But here's what he said in his book. He said, a school's mission and vision must be formulated on the basis of shared theological convictions about the nature of God's mission in the world and the role of God's people in that mission and the unique contribution theological education can make to that mission. Mark Young puts it very well, very succinctly, very much on point. He is saying that we need to understand what is the mission of God? What is the Missio Dei? How is it that God wants to unfold his global mission for the world? And the role of his people in doing so, and the role of theological education then to come in and support the people in getting that work done. There's a Lausanne. I've mentioned Lausanne in other videos, and I'll mention Lausanne here and there because they've made some really remarkable contributions to global thinking about the church and mission, but also they will include some things about theological education and training and equipping future leaders. They made a statement back in 2010 that I found to be really a clever way of saying what I am saying here. Let me just share what they said. They said, we urge that institutions and programs of theological education. Now, notice what they're doing. They're saying institutions, the more formal side of theological education, but also on the non-formal side, any program of theological education should conduct a missional audit of their curricular structures and ethos to ensure that that they truly serve the needs and opportunities facing the church in their cultures. What Lausanne is doing is they are challenging us to keep in mind that we must continue to evaluate, to assess what is it that our programs are doing in terms of meeting the needs of the church today in their cultures. I talk about the theological education being most alive when it's meeting the current realities and the future challenges of the church. Lausanne is, in essence, saying the same thing. I also say it this way. You see, can we suggest then that in certain ways, certain parts of the world, theological education has somewhat lost its way? It's one true mission, it's one true direction, its purpose to strengthen and accompany the church in its mission. It is not always there. And just hear me clearly on this. If that is true, and if that is what is happening in some, not all, but in some training programs around the world, how is it then that we could meet the challenge of preparing church leaders for the growth of the church in the global South? We've talked about that in other videos. We talked about there being one trained pastor for every 230 in the U.S. and 1 to 450,000 outside of the U.S. We have to do something about this. But if training programs in theological education is not centered on the church as a core of its mission, how will we ever be able to get to that and address the needs of the church around the world today? We have used words over the past, words like resetting theological education, reworking theological education, reconnecting theological education, rebranding. How about renewal? How many times have we heard about renewal in theological education? Renewal has been a word that we've been using for theological education for decades, and I'm not sure if we've really gotten there to that point. You see, it is not just about rethinking our courses. It's not just about our programs, our curricula, our libraries, how we deliver courses and all those. It's not just about that. And it's not just about accreditation or validation services that we have out there. It's not just about that. It's about more than that. It's about recalibrating. It's not just about setting new courses. It's about recalibrating what we think about theological education and its purpose. And so I say this, theological education in all its forms, whether formal, non-formal, doesn't matter, in all its forms, ought to regularly recalibrate to its true course as God's core vessel to steady the church for its mission. Theological education's true course as an instrument of God to be recalibrated to make sure we're heading in the direction that God intended us to head in terms of theological education. In other videos, we talked about the massive global crises of the church around the world today, not having enough church leaders prepared to serve them. Theological education has not been able to meet the massive growth that's happening in the church around the world today. And some of it is because theological education, quite frankly, has moved away from its core purpose, its true course, its true direction, and has become less and less relevant to culture, church, and society. What if, imagine with me, what if theological education in all its forms was to recalibrate to its true course, the church? Would it become more connected to current realities and some of the challenges of the church? Would it become more relevant to the church today? As you look at your training programs, perhaps you're in the middle of thinking about, how do I teach this course? Maybe you're a teacher, maybe you're a leader, maybe you are an administrator in a training program, whether it be formal or non-formal. Here is what I'm asking you to do. I am asking you to think about, like Lausanne put it, what would it look like for us to do a missional audit? And by that we mean, how can we look at what we're doing, our programs, our curricula, the whole thing, our ethos? How can we be looking at what we're doing as a training program and begin to think about how is it that what we are doing is actually impacting doing something within the church today? How is it that our leaders, those that are graduating from our programs, how are they better equipped to lead the church in its current challenges in various cultures? Now, we have churches all over the world, don't we? And we have training programs all over the world. How is it, friends, that these training programs and institutions, Bible colleges, all across the board, how is it that we can begin to, how is it that you can begin to think about your program actually doing something that directly impacts your leaders' work in the churches today? Continue to join us as we reimagine theological education together.